If you want to read a book with actual ideas to shatter or at least disturb long-held presuppositions, to anarchically disrupt and enlighten from a truly sinister point of view, stay tuned. Welcome to Be Blue Cultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Also, remember to follow me on X if you want to check out what I'm up to, and you can message me directly if you wish, make book recommendations, that kind of thing. And check out my merch store if you want to support what I'm doing here. I would really appreciate if you do any of these things, and like I said, even just sharing the content and liking it and that kind of thing really helps out. So I really appreciate you doing all these things. In this episode, I'm going over the book No by Boyd Rice. Now, this book is a self-published book from 2017, and I'm pretty sure you can still find it online on CreateSpace or Lulu or different places. I think it should be available. Now, Boyd Rice has always been an ever-present but somewhat obscure personality in the left-hand path for many decades. He's well known and beloved to those in the know, as you would say, and he's also hated on by many, I would argue, that don't know him that much or don't know his artistic output. In my opinion, his relevance is not limited to the left-hand path per se, which is the blanket category in which most people who are labeled occultist or Satanist or Luciferian would fall into, because he has traveled outside of those circles for many years. And I would probably assume that he would not like necessarily the label per se. But I believe that he is a figure of the true American counterculture and an icon of my generation, even if he's not that well known as he should be. Now, this particular book is divided into ideas and topics into which he basically gives general comments to. So the structure is very clean, very simple. He just gives you the concepts and then he addresses them and discusses them. Now, at first glance, this book may appear to be a classic postmodernist treatise because of the fact that he questions truth itself from the very beginning. But for me, he is doing something else. He is forcing the reader to simply reconsider truth and make sure that they are foundationally sound. So there are many writers in history that tend to do something very similar, that they don't necessarily are making waves for the sake of destruction, but they're making waves for the sake of reconsideration or reformulation. And they actually help you to restructure your own thoughts and rethink the way that you have settled on certain concepts as absolute truths. And I think this kind of writer is important for that reason. Let me give you an example of what I mean by just reading a small quote here. And this is on the controversial topic of equality. Have you ever seen a demonstrable example of equality in your entire life? Can it be glimpsed in any dog show or classroom? In any ping pong game or chess match? Of course not. It is a philosophical abstraction, something nowhere to be found in nature. Is 50 pounds of lead somehow equal to 50 pounds of gold? And if you say yes, what do you mean by equal? In another short quote in the same section, the fact that more than 200 years on, our lawmakers are still debating laws to enforce, even sanction equality, speaks volumes. Realities don't require votes or majorities, nor could votes or majorities affect genuine realities. So there you have a very straightforward presentation and feel of how the author navigates a topic. And clearly, he is applying a very practical point of view to a deeply philosophical question. But he has a very good ability to simplify, to reduce complex questions and complex concepts into very simple, everyday language to communicate a very deep truth. His critique of individuality and identity are quite significant in my opinion also, and very clear-headed. Individuality is truly nowhere to be found, again, just like equality. And our entire identity infrastructure is based on collective sources. And this criticism is actually very brave on his part, since it really destroys the entire belief system of most modern occultism and the world in general. And I would argue this is the cultic dogma of the modern world, that individuality is absolute and that identity within this individual experience is absolute and true and is sacred. And all of this is quite modern. So as a religion, modernism, and I'm not referring to the Catholic heresy called modernism, although they're related, but just modernism in general and postmodernism in general is obsessed with atomization and with individuality to such a level that it is ridiculous. And by pointing out that identity is collective, he's also pointing out that individuality is basically impossible. And doing so in such a simple fashion is very powerful indeed. He rightly admits that peace, as it's usually advocated for, is impossible without an autocratic, authoritarian imposition, and that harmony is incoherent without the notion of hierarchy. So conceptually, these ideas of harmony and peace are sterile, basically, because without the authoritarian imposition of certain conditions for there to be peace and a lack of conflict, you will not be able to sustain such peace, like the Pax Romana, to give you an example, which requires a very strong authoritarian government to keep things in check. And harmony, conceptually speaking, also requires a hierarchy of authority and value and a collaboration of different parts doing different things, like in Plato's Republic. It cannot happen in a so-called egalitarian democratic system because it is inharmonious, it is chaotic. So again, very bold for him to just put that out there, because it is a fact that most people in the modern world will not appreciate, because they are part of a secular religion that sees these values as absolute and unquestionable. Dubious concepts like natural rights, from which we get things like human rights, etc., which were brought to us by the likes of Rousseau and Locke in particular, but that they are really pure fantasy, and natural things don't require codes and institutions to enforce them. And this is a critique I've done for years of the very notion of rights, because as time goes by, people keep adding rights or subtracting rights. So it is an ideological conception, and it comes from a time in which, again, there was a slow development of a new religion, and this new Enlightenment secular religion required dogmas, belief in certain ideas, conceptions, gods, devils, etc. So that most people walking around, they're part of a cult, and this cult is secular humanism. And secular humanism, as a religious concept, has infiltrated almost all modern religions, converting them into their religion. So it's very fascinating, because you see ancient religions adapting themselves to a new religion, which is called secular humanism, with all the accoutrements of this cult. The notion of absolute equality, democracy, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, conceptions of individuality and absolute personal independence. And all these conceptions, even if you agree with them and you think they're wonderful, they are part of an infrastructure that is quite recent, and it reflects a particular ideology that is incompatible with all traditional religious systems. So when you try to mix them, it creates quite a mess, which is, I think, is the reason why Boyd Rice dislikes most religions. But I think that what he's identifying is the same thing I identified, which is that when I looked at these religions, I'm not seeing the ancient religion. I'm actually seeing the modern secular humanist religion superimposed on top of an old religion. And this comes to the notion of democracy, which is another very important component of the secular humanist religion. And he critiques it from a political point of view, basically arguing that it is a tool of the powerful to control the masses, to agitate them into acting in particular ways and believing that majority belief means truth. That just because everyone agrees on X point makes that X point correct. Now, traditionalists would argue that this is the problem with the system, because if something is true, if truth actually exists, it cannot be denied or affirmed by majority vote. If something is true, it is true irrespective of whether everyone agrees or nobody agrees. From his point of view, he's actually critiquing it from a pragmatic point of view, but it's still a very good critique. Now, he goes into this notion of hope and dreams, which I thought was pretty funny, because he's arguing that these emotions don't necessarily encourage action. That when you have a lot of hope and you have these dreams, you will kind of remain in that mindset, expecting something to happen, but not really putting anything into action to make it happen. Now, this to me is fascinating because, again, it goes back to the absurdity of ideas like faith alone and grace alone, and a lot of these modern conceptions that, in my opinion, opened up the Enlightenment, started a lot in the Reformation with nominalism and the separation of ideas or words from reality. So there's a separation between concept and action, and trying to divorce belief or affirmations of will that are internal from actual external manifestations. He's criticizing it from just being pragmatic. If you have a lot of dreams and hopes and you don't do anything about it, there's no point to it. But by doing so, he's also criticizing a core value of the modern world, which is that it is sufficient sometimes to just believe. That's how secularism started, because if belief and action are technically separate and there's something involved inside, it's an internal dynamic experience that is independent of the external world or your capacity to effectuate it, then you basically have a justification for secularism. Now, the author's critique of degeneracy and decadence is quite pragmatic as well, but it does echo traditionalists like Julius Evoline, except that Rice is focusing on the very real experience of having to contend with people of this low caliber. So to him, it reminds me a little bit of LaVey, when she's just complaining and annoyed at drunks and drug addicts, etc., how terrible it is to hang out with these people who are so self-absorbed and self-destructive, etc. So when you contend with people like this, and I have in my past, it's quite obvious it is a horrible experience and you don't want to deal with it. So he's kind of looking at it from that perspective. But by critiquing degeneracy and decadence, he's actually making a traditionalist argument. And that in itself to me is fascinating. Let me read another quote that I think is relevant to the topic here. Resentment only shrinks to envy in those cases in which worldly riches are the byproduct of happenstance, rather than vision, diligence, or hard work. Most people consider success something they could never attain through their own efforts, putting their faith instead in a truly American ideal, pure dumb luck. Now, I love that quote because it actually gave me a very interesting perspective on it that I've never thought about before until I read it there, which is the fact that popular culture tends to resent the powerful and the rich, unless they think they are either talentless or they gained this wealth out of insane luck or insane lack of ability or merit. In other words, that American culture has morphed from an appreciation of merit as a way of reaching success to a new formula in which what makes something amazing, like what is the American dream, is to invent some kind of toy that makes you a billionaire for no reason, or come up with some idea that seems ridiculous and then you become a billionaire even though it is ridiculous and everyone agrees objectively that it is. Meaning the notion of the American dream has become a lottery type of conception The American dream is that somehow or other, by some dumb luck or some strange circumstance, I stumble upon riches. And now I did it. And people like that tend to be appreciated and even loved and made celebrities. But those that somehow or other, through invention or very long, arduous process, become wealthy and powerful, they are seen as perverse or evil somehow, or even corrupt, so that the entire culture has been placed upside down in almost a bizarro state. And him pointing that out to me made me think of that, and I appreciate it, actually. So, to close off, this book is basically a critique of idealism, and with his realistic approach, nonetheless, what I found interesting is that he has an amazing affinity with bare bones traditionalism. So yes, he comes with a sharp razor blade, and he's cutting through, and it's a lot of fun to read. And it's not every day that you read a book that deals with these topics that is actually a lot of fun. But this book is. But to me, what is fascinating is to find that convergence between a radical, rebellious personality like Boyd Rice actually making the case for positions that are traditionally seen as part of the conservative milieu. So this book also brought back some nostalgia, because a lot of his writing reminds me of Anton LaVey's writing in books like the Satanic Bible, which I actually did a book review of both the Satanic Bible from LaVey and also Michael Aquino's version of it. If you want to check it out, just go on my playlist and put Satanic Bible, you'll find it. Because the style of writing is very similar to LaVey, and I've always found when I was a kid, LaVey's writing to be very pleasant, very lighthearted, and a combination of hard punching with humor. So I appreciated that as well. And ideologically, I appreciate it even more because as an adult, I can relate better to this kind of mood than to the kind of laissez-faire, individualist, kind of libertarian mood of LaVey in the 60s. So hopefully you enjoy the review, and it encourages you to get this book and read it if you're into the topic. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. It really helps out. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.